Today, the sun begins to set on the Empire of the Rising Sun. The decisive battle to destroy the American Navy had failed. Their overland offensive through the Kokoda Track had failed. Their attempts to recapture Guadalcanal and its important airfield had failed. Meanwhile, the Americans had successfully landed their counteroffensive on the southern Solomons, and the Australians had managed to corner the invaders at the Buna-Gona area. Thus, the initiative has finally slipped out of the hands of the Japanese, and now it's their turn to go on the defensive. Yet it will be long until complete darkness falls over the Japanese Empire, as their stubborn and tenacious forces are prepared to give one hell of a fight. Join us as we delve into the start of the long and bloody Battle of Buna-Gona in this new episode of the Pacific War. While we learn of this unimaginable strife fighting over territory, wouldn't you like to rest assured that you have a safe plot of your own out there in the world that brings not war, but restoration of forests? I say this because we've got another offer from our sponsor, Established Titles. They sell small plots of land in Scotland, which are sought after because of a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lairds, or lords and ladies in English. But to protect these lands, a tree is planted with every order, and Established Titles supports charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. So it's a fun and novel way to preserve the natural woodlands of Scotland while helping global reforestation efforts. You'll get at least 1 square foot of land in Scotland with a unique plot number and a certificate to prove it. This allows you to officially get Lord or Lady on your credit cards, plane tickets and more. You can also get maps to show your new estate, including the immensely detailed, hand-drawn 1611 map by John Speed, held by the National Library of Scotland. It makes a great last-minute gift, and they even have couple packs that come with adjoining plots of land. The first 200 plots bought via our link will all be put together within a few minutes of each other next to the Kings and Generals plot, so act fast to join our little union of forest territories. Check out their Black Friday sale for discounts. Plus, if you use our code KINGS, you'll get an extra 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/kings to get yourself a title or give it as a gift and help support the channel. This week first takes us to the direct aftermath of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The American victory had been completely decisive, and although the 17th Army didn't know it yet, Yamamoto and the IJN now considered that Island of Death to be lost. In contrast, the Americans knew that their grip on Guadalcanal was now assured, and so they began to lay out plans to finally withdraw the battered and exhausted 1st Marine Division, which would be replaced with Army troops. In the meantime, however, there were still 2 important groups of Japanese forces on the island. Next week we'll cover the tribulations of the Shoji detachment and the long patrol of Colonel Carlson and his raiders in more detail. But today we head again to the Manticore, where Vandergrift was planning to conduct his 3rd offensive of the month. Under the overall command of General Sebri, the newly arrived 182nd Regiment would first cross the Manticore to secure the western bank of the river. Then the 182nd would be joined by the 164th Regiment and the 8th Marines to launch a general drive to the Poha River. On November 18th, the 2nd Battalion of the 182nd Regiment was the first to cross the river, immediately pushing southwest towards a long ridge called Hill 66. By noon, after meeting only a small enemy patrol, the soldiers had finished their 2,000-yard march to Hill 66. The following morning, the 1st Battalion of the 182nd Regiment also crossed the Manticore and commenced their advance to secure Hill 78, just south of Point Cruz. Yet awaiting them was the 16th Regiment of Colonel Seka Yoshitsugu, who managed to force them back from Hill 78 with strong fire. Pinned down, the Americans would then have to dig in for the night, as they were subjected to Japanese artillery and mortar fire. During the night, Sakai would also launch a strong counteroffensive, successfully pushing back the Americans some 400 yards along the beach. Yet Sebri would quickly restore order among his forces, and with air or artillery support, they would regain their lost positions by 0900, positions they would continue to hold for the rest of the day against the incessant attacks of the enemy. With the situation stabilized, Sebri decided on the morning of November 21st to send the 164th Regiment into the gap between the 182nd's battalions, tasking them with the capture of Hills 82, 83 and 84. But they were also met by the murderous fire of the Japanese, who managed to stop their advance after only 40 yards. On the coast, meanwhile, the 182nd launched a renewed assault against Sakai, successfully reducing the point crews' positions, but only achieving 100 yards of westward motion. With the tenacious Japanese defenders strongly resisting the attacks of the American soldiers, the situation would remain the same for the following day, and it wouldn't be until November 23rd that Sebri would send the 8th Marines to break through towards Hill 83. Advancing on a narrow approach, however, Japanese fire would smother the Marine advance, and a deadly mortar bombardment would inflict many casualties on the 164th Regiment. In the face of mounting casualties, Vandergrift would finally halt the offensive on November 23rd, ordering the forces on the front to dig in along a line stretching from Hill 66 to Point Cruz. In the meantime, the recent losses at Oivi-Gorari and Henderson Field now forced the IJA to reorganize the Southern Expeditionary Army on November 16th to deal more effectively with the deteriorating situation in New Guinea and Guadalcanal. Thus, the 8th Area Army was born, led by General Imamura, who had overseen the conquest of the Dutch East Indies. Under his command and supervision would be General Hyakutake's 17th Army, which would now operate solely in the Solomons area, and the newly established 18th Army of Lieutenant General Adachi Hatazo, which would take control of the operations on New Guinea. Whereas Adachi's immediate task was the successful defense of the Buna-Gona area, Imamura and Hyakutake immediately started to work on the final recapture of Guadalcanal, still perceiving that victory had only been narrowly missed in October, and that a modest increment in effort could secure their long-sought triumph. This shows that the IJA was still adamant in their efforts to win the decisive Battle of Guadalcanal, something that had already been discarded by Yamamoto and the IJN. And back to New Guinea, MacArthur's final counteroffensive was at last ready to be launched, and he wanted a quick victory before the Navy won at Guadalcanal, so he could indisputably command the drive to Tokyo. While the Australians continued to pursue the enemy back along the Kokoda Track, MacArthur and General Blamey had planned to make a secret, wide envelopment to the east by flying American forces from Major General Edwin Harding's 32nd Division to strike at the enemy left flank in the vicinity of Buna. We'll recall that in October, the 2nd Battalion of the 126th Regiment had set off along the Jure Trail, yet they were extremely unprepared for the difficult trek over the Owen Stanley Range, suffering from diseases like malaria and dysentery. Additionally, the 128th Regiment had been flown to Wenigella by October 18th, and they would then board 20-ton motor launches to sail up the coast towards Pongani, where they halted to construct a landing strip on October 26th. Finally, the bulk of the 126th Regiment would be flown directly to Pongani's new strip by November 11th, arriving 9 days before its Ghost Battalion, which was in such bad condition that they had to be left in reserve for a week. Meanwhile, as the South Seas Detachment delayed the Australian advance on the Kokoda Track, Japanese engineers were building a network of defences in the Buna-Gona area, with hundreds of bunkers that were hard to spot, resistant to bullets, or that forced approaching troops to wade through swamps or cross open grassland to get to them. Additionally, they also built crawl trenches joining the bunkers, which allowed the defensive troops to move around the network and also served as lateral lines of covering fire. Furthermore, heavily camouflaged snipers were placed in treetops to pin down the enemy as they reached the coastal plain. In the absence of General Hori, whose fate was then unknown, command of the defense of Buna-Gona was under Colonel Yokoyama. He counted with the 3rd Battalion of the 41st Regiment at Girua, a group of SNLF Marines and engineers at Buna that totaled around 2,000 men, and an 800-strong road construction unit of Takasago volunteers at Gona, with a small detachment of the 41st Regiment. With few trained combat troops among them, Yokoyama knew that this was going to be a desperate defensive operation until reinforcements arrived, even going so far as to issue an edict that prohibited retreating. At this point, the 41st and 144th Regiments at the Kamusi River were still withdrawing from Gorari through the Sanananda Track, and they would set up new positions on the way to Garua. Additionally, Colonel Yazawa's 1st Battalion had continued on to the mouth of the Komusi, so Yokoyama would have to send all available barges from Gona to bring them to Garuwa. Unfortunately, Allied planes attacked, and only 500 soldiers, including Yazawa himself, would reach Garuwa by November 29th, with the rest of the battalion being forced to continue on foot towards Gona. In pursuit of the retreating Japanese forces, the 7th Division of General Vasi had crossed the Komusi River by November 16th, yet its 2 brigades would continue their advance on separate parallel tracks. Whereas Brigadier Lloyd's 16th Brigade would make for the sea at Sanananda Point. The 25th Brigade of Brigadier Ether would move forward on the left axis towards Gona. In the meantime, General Harding was planning to move north from Saputa in 2 columns. And because the Allies controlled Milner Bay and Goodenough Island, they were planning to supply this force mainly by sea, even though the Americans only counted with 7 luggers and a captured Japanese barge. On November 16th, the Americans thus began to move forward, and they also sent 3 luggers and their barge towards Oro Bay to unload rations, ammunition and men, including Harding himself. The heaviest weapons they could carry were light machine guns and mortars. Yet unexpectedly, 14 Zeros fell upon them around Cape Sudest, destroying all 4 craft and forcing Harding and the survivors to swim ashore. With 2 more luggers getting destroyed the next morning, the American supply plan had been completely disrupted, forcing them to rely on airdrops until a new field at Dobudura could be constructed to afford air support for the surface transports. Despite this, by November 18th, the 128th Regiment had advanced up to Hariko and Simemi, and the bulk of the 126th Regiment had reached the vicinity of Inonda to protect the eastern flank of the Australians. Their mission was to retake Buna with speed, and luckily for them, their scouts reported that the garrison at Buna appeared to be very weak, and that their bunkers were nothing more than hasty field entrenchments. Thus, the Americans expected to end the campaign with one quick attack. Unfortunately for them, their reports were tremendously wrong, and it was one hell of a fight that was really awaiting them at Buna. By November 18th, meanwhile, the Japanese had also landed some 1,500 soldiers at Buna, including the 3rd Battalion of the 229th Regiment, which would be grouped under the command of Colonel Yamamoto Shigemi. Captain Yasuda Yoshihatsu immediately deployed them on his eastern flank, with his SNLF Marines protecting Buna village and the government station nearby, as he believed the enemy attack was likely to come from the sea. Yamamoto's line of defense thus ran through the Juropa plantation to the airstrips and across the bridge between them, with outposts covering its approaches. In the meantime, the 25th Brigade had pushed across the tropical lowlands, with its men suffering from steaming heat, mud, fever and sore feet. They would reach Jombora on November 18th, sending forward a small patrol to occupy Gona if no enemy presence was found, or alternatively to report their strength. The following day, the 60-man patrol met strong opposition as the Australians tried to advance through a large kunai patch just south of Gona. In response, Brigadier Ether sent the 2nd 31st Battalion in the afternoon to clear the way, yet the tenacious defenders at the kunai clearings soon forced them to dig in a semicircle before Gona. But as the night advanced, the 2nd 31st started to suffer heavy casualties, even losing 4 of its company commanders, something that eventually forced Ether to order their withdrawal. Under the cover of darkness, the Australians would successfully pull back behind the Amboga crossing, yet the activeness of the enemy defenders showed them that Gona would be harder to take than they thought. Thus, Ether would decide to wait for supplies on November 20th, with supply aircraft finally appearing the following day. With his forces now well fed and equipped, the 2nd 31st and 2nd 33rd Battalions were earmarked to launch a second attack for November 22nd. Meanwhile, the tired and hungry men of the 6th Brigade slowly marched through deep creeks and dense forests. Their advance was further hampered by heavy rains that flooded the creeks and made their crossings very hazardous, with many of their soldiers falling down gasping beside the track even before they engaged the enemy. By November 18th, however, they had reached Popondetta, with promises that supplies would be awaiting them at Saputa. At the same time, the 126th Regiment found that it couldn't establish radio contact with Vasi's forces. so the Americans decided to send a detachment towards Saputo to prevent a surprise enemy counterattack through there. Early on November 19th, they would find that Brigadier Lloyd's forces were past Popondetta, so the Americans would continue their advance towards Horanda. Scarcely had they reached Horanda that the 126th was informed that it had been put under Vassi's command, and that it needed to march to Saputo to reinforce the 16th Brigade. On this day, the Australians also began to encounter the first enemy elements waiting for them in the bushes. Despite this, the 2nd 3rd Battalion would reach Saputo by nightfall, finally encountering some much-needed supplies. The following morning, Lloyd's men would continue to press ahead to Sanananda to cut the coastal track that led to Buna. Yet the 2nd 1st Battalion would soon enter into an open kunai patch where Colonel Tsukamoto's South Seas detachment was waiting in ambush. Rapid volleys and effective artillery fire then started to fall on them, quickly scattering the Australians and forcing them to slow their advance. But no matter what the enemy might do, the relentless Australians continued to push on, as 2 small detachments were sent to flank the Japanese positions and force them to retreat. Although the right flank unit rapidly smashed the Japanese left flank, inflicting heavy casualties on the Kawada Battalion and killing Colonel Kawada, the Australians would be held against their main positions as the defenders tenaciously resisted their assaults. By late afternoon, as the first American elements started to reach Saputo, the vicious fighting finally forced Lloyd to send the 2nd 3rd and 2nd 2nd Battalions to reinforce the positions of the 2nd 1st and its right flank unit. But during the night, the 90 men of the left-wing unit, under the command of Captain Basil Caterns, were finally approaching the main track and would then stealthily infiltrate the Japanese positions through the silent bushes, successfully getting to 50 yards off the enemy line before the Japanese began to unleash their firepower upon them. Yet the Australians fiercely resisted the enemy attacks, hurling forward straight for the centre of the main defensive position at a great cost in lives. At last he managed to dig in on a small salient in the main Japanese line, thus severely threatening the defenders' positions. With daybreak on November 21st, Caterns would have to desperately resist many strong counterattacks by the tenacious Japanese, while the 2nd 2nd and 2nd 3rd Battalion pressed forward to relieve the Australian pocket. By nightfall, Caterns' manoeuvre had effectively forced the main Japanese force to withdraw, with the 2nd 3rd taking position on his rear to relieve them by midnight. And further east, on November 19th, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 128th Regiment started to move north under torrential rain to strike at the Japanese eastern flank. Yet their advance would soon be stopped by intense rifle and automatic fire around the new strip. The American National Servicemen paid dearly for their inexperience, as their leading units lost contact with one another and even with themselves during their advance through the jungles and swamps. Whereas the 1st Battalion was bewildered by the impression that the enemy surrounded them, the 3rd Battalion came under such intense fire on the wooden causeway of the Samemi Creek that it was forced to a halt. General Harding counted with a detachment of the 1st Battalion 126th Regiment and the 2nd 6th Independent Company as direct reserves for the coastal advance, while the 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment was at Dobodura in reserve for the 3rd Battalion's attack. He also planned to employ the 126th Regiment to engage the western flank of the Buna position, yet their redeployment to the Sanananda front ruined his plans and forced him to appoint his 2nd Battalion to command the western assault. As the forces on the front were getting pinned down by well-camouflaged Japanese machine gun posts that couldn't even be spotted by the Americans, Harding had no other choice but to stop the attack. This would give him time to divide his forces into 2 task forces, with the Urbana Force preparing for the western attack and the Warren Force of Brigadier General Hanford McNider launching its second assault on the east the following day. This time, with the aid of aircraft and with minimum artillery support, the 1st Battalion would manage to push about 100 yards, yet the 3rd Battalion would again fail to advance past the bridge. But this is it for this week. The Allies had been naively expecting a quick victory at Buna-Gona, but instead they would have to endure a devastatingly drawn-out affair thanks to the effective efforts of the Japanese defenders. Next episode, we'll continue to cover the developments of the Battle of Buna-Gona as the Allies continue to attempt to rush the enemy defences, and we'll also head back to Guadalcanal to cover the fate of the Shoji detachment during Carlson's long patrol.
Thanks again to our sponsor Established Titles. Buy a small plot of land in Scotland and become a lady or a lord, or give this title as an amazing and easy gift. In return, Established Titles plants a tree to protect the pristine forests of our planet. Take advantage of their early Black Friday sale and use our discount code KINGS at establishedtitles.com/kings to get a further 10% off.
Make sure to subscribe and press the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps us immensely. Our videos would be impossible to produce without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links down in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.